Well, welcome everyone to this event this afternoon. We're here to talk about constructing a low-carbon future, how are leading businesses paving the way to lower emission steel and concrete sourcing. My name's Mike Pearce from the Climate Group. We're a UK-based and also international NGO focused on driving climate action fast. I think most events in this sort of piece always say we've got the most important sector to drive action, and I think in this case it's really true, we do. Steel and concrete are some of the most polluting sectors in the world, accounting between them for around 15% of emissions. But more positively than that, they're also materials that are incredibly important to the delivery of a low carbon future. So they really matter for the emissions, and we know they'll be important in the transition. The users of the materials, in particular, I think have got a critical role in creating the market for lower emission steel. Thanks. And so today we're going to explore how leading businesses are paving the way for lower emission materials. We've got a range of organisations here from across the value chain, from a steel maker, Tata Steel, as well as some businesses from Climate Group's SteelZero and ConcreteZero campaign. Organisations that have made bold commitments around the materials they want to produce and the reduction in emissions from that. Very much hope we are going to have a practical session for you today. These are companies that are wrestling with these issues, and we're hoping to share some ideas about what that means for how they're thinking about this in the next few years, and we very much hope there'll be ideas that you can take forward in your organisations too. So, you can see who's with us today. We have Michaela Lindridge from Severfield, Nick Silk from Tata Steel, Ida Krabeck from Ørsted, Ben White from Kilnbridge, and Jennifer Late from Arup. So really look forward to hearing their thoughts on this. We're going to start with Ben. Find you across the room here. So Ben, you've been a member of ConcreteZero, our campaign around this area, and I'd be interested to know how your procurement policies and tender process have evolved since joining them. Maybe sharing some of the practical steps that Kilnbridge has taken to unlock progress in sourcing low-carbon concrete and steel.
Thanks, Mike. Let me just introduce Kilnbridge for a minute, because we're not only a member of ConcreteZero, but SteelZero as well. We're a Tier 2 contractor specialising in reinforced concrete structures and structural steel structures across the whole country. And concrete is obviously one of our biggest spends in terms of materials. So since becoming ConcreteZero members, it's become a real focus for us in terms of the embodied carbon associated with each mix. So one of the changes is that for every mix design we receive now, normally at tender, but then they're finalised after contract awards, we're not only looking at the cost of those mixes, the volumes of the mixes, but also the associated embodied carbon with them. And then with that embodied carbon, we compare them to previous mixes we've used on other projects with similar materials to compare carbon levels to see if we can reduce them, but also the ConcreteZero standards, which we regularly report to. And then lastly, I guess another change is in the structural steel side of things. So we now, by default, source our steel through electric arc furnace rather than blast furnace for wherever we can, which is the majority of the time.
Great. No, thanks very much for getting started on that point. So as I mentioned at the start, we've got a number of organisations here looking at working from the supply and demand side on this, and one of the interesting part is how we can get perspective on how that interaction between those works and the role of them. Michaela, turning to you as a steelwork contractor, and you may want to say a little bit about Severfield in that part. Could you talk a bit about a part your organisation plays in creating demand and shaping demand? How have you approached supplier engagement in that work?
Absolutely. Severfield, those of you who haven't heard about us, is the UK largest structural steel fabricator. Which means that we don't actually produce the steel. We take the steel, we design and fabricate it we take it from the producers such as Tata in the room, and we fabricate it into the end product, which could be anything from the well-liked iconic buildings of London skyline, such as the Shard. Not many people know that the steel for Shard came from our factory in North Yorkshire, as well as steel components for the likes of Ørsted, who is also on the panel with us today. And the question was, could you repeat that?
Yeah, so I mean, in a sense, how have you approached supplier engagement to ensure your decarbonisation goals are met?
Perfect. Thank you for the reminder. I would say that as a steel fabricator is always very challenging because we don't produce the steel ourselves. We are sort of in the middle. We deal with client requirements, demands, and targets they set out for the projects per gross internal area. And we have to work with those suppliers very closely in order to understand their own decarbonization strategies. So we've taken an active approach in understanding our supply chain in detail in terms of where are they on their journey, what technologies are they choosing to achieve decarbonization targets, as well as what material data do they have available, whether that's through environmental product declarations or any other detailed verified sources. We really need to understand their carbon impact across the life cycle, so we can then demonstrate to our clients the overall impact of our structures. So this was really important for us to understand in terms of the supply chain and engage with them as they are on the different parts of their journey. And as Ben mentioned, it's also very different for each of the products. So flat products are a lot more ahead than, for example, hollow sections, or you have different type of steels, and I'm not a steel expert or a technical engineer in that sense, but from the understanding of the product there, if you'd like to build a electric arc furnace bridge, that steel is currently still not available on the market.
Yeah, I think, Michaela, you've really hit one of the important bits of this debate around the complexity of this in terms of the different products that are required by organisations, the availability of materials for those different needs, and getting information understanding from someone on the buy side about how you can make sense of that and act on that. So I think that's a really important part of the complexity, and why some of the knowledge sharing amongst organisations in the space is very important. Actually, in some sense, Nick, turning to an aspect of that in terms of how demand itself is not straightforward and simple, is there's obviously different needs and different behaviours across sectors. You've obviously got customers that may be in construction or automotive sector, and indeed others. How does this affect the different demand side, affect your ability to invest in lower carbon steel making?
Thanks very much. I'm Nick Silt from Tata Steel. So we obviously make flat strip products. Just first of all to say that we're very lucky to work with SteelZero members who are extremely carbon literate and really understand the information they're asking for. So that makes it easy. But we see across the different sectors, automotive and packaging and other sectors that we work in, we've had to go through a sort of 5-year learning exercise to help our customers really understand the steel, its carbon footprint, what contributes, etc. And so there's a lot of engagement gone on there. But separately, to then move on to the point you were making, Mike, we see that in construction there are certain projects where the client is absolutely striving for the lowest possible carbon footprint they can achieve today on a particular project, etc. Whereas we're seeing that in the automotive sector, the customers are much more interested in what's your trajectory for decarbonisation. Can you give us this carbon footprint this year, that carbon footprint in 5 years' time, etc. They want to know the plan, they want to know the predictability of that trajectory. And so rather than us chasing very low carbon footprint projects now, actually following a sector that is following a trajectory is a bit easier for us in practice. And that means that we then can have the confidence in knowing that our investments, because it's very large investments, they take many years to complete. So our Port Talbot project will take us 3 years to complete. It cost £1.5 billion. We've got to make big commitments, and we've got to know that the result at the end of it is in line with the customer's requirements at the end of that.
Yeah, really helpful points to make here, Nick. And something that really struck me when I first sort of started working in some of this space was the importance of, in a sense, what seems like the easy challenge of just how do I buy the lowest carbon product I can have so I can demonstrate that, versus the much bigger challenge of how we transition a steel industry across the world, including those that are at much higher carbon intensities, and finding progress levels that the demand side can say, this is how we can demonstrate we're making a move to reduce the emissions. Because if we're only looking at just those lower carbon parts, we don't deal with the biggest problems there are around this. So this complex story of how you then communicate that beyond becomes very important. Jennifer, if I could turn to you now from Arup, and again, you may want to introduce the organisation just to get that started. be keen to get from you some insight on the sort of supply chain challenges that you've encountered in your work. How have you worked through those to make sort of keep momentum on your goals in this space?
Yeah, thank you. So Arab are designers, so we sit. Is that working? Yeah. Yes. So yes, hello. Arab are a global consultancy of designers working on many different types of building structures, infrastructure, built environment, with my particular interest being in flood risk. And I think it's also important not just to frame this under net zero, but as an industry, we've got so much that we still need to build in terms of infrastructure over the next 30 to 50 years. We also have a productivity and an efficiency crisis. We have people leaving the industry, and we have, as a construction sector, we need to do much better in terms of productivity. And why am I saying all of that? Because we need to look at these challenges as a whole. So some of the challenges that we are seeing in terms of the supply chain are with some of these more novel products. We can see that things can potentially take longer if they're thought about much later on in the cycle. One example might be lower carbon concrete, usually takes longer to cure, but that then gives us an immense opportunity to look at modern methods of construction off-site, which also then has health and safety advantages because you're not then batching stuff on site. But then that feeds into some of the challenges when you're first trialling and using some of these technologies. In the flood risk sector, we need things to work under variable loading. Most of the time, a flood risk asset sits there, it does nothing. But then when it needs to work, it actually needs to work. You need to deal with debris strike, you've got that variable loading, you don't know when a flood's going to happen. So in terms of trialling and testing, it's really important that we understand how this is going to work in the future. So when we're looking at low carbon concrete, often we're not able to batch that at scale at the minute. Sometimes we've got examples of where we're batching it on site in the trucks, which again then adds an extra dimension to understanding the performance, the specification, the workability. So there's definitely more to be done in that sector. Other examples is we're also not only looking at steel has sort of been mentioned about how we can decarbonise the production of steel, but also how can we get better at the reuse of steel? So often we might have over-ordered quantities of materials, sheet piles, for example. How can we start exploring the reuse of that in a flood situation where we can move one set of steel sheet piles that are maybe over-purchased to a totally different site when you may not know the history of those piles, how have they been stored, how long have they been stored, and therefore how will they perform once they're installed. How are we working with suppliers to overcome those? Collaboration is really key, so I'm lucky to work with the Environment Agency, and the way in which the Environment Agency have set up their frameworks is for most of their flood defence stuff, it's non-competitive, so we work alongside our contractor partners, we work alongside our client, and we have those very pragmatic conversations around risk, around the testing, around the specifications, how can we work with these more novel ways in a way that everyone within that supply chain is bought into the way forward.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'm sure there's a key bit here in the knowledge and experience that an organisation like yours can share around that and build awareness when this is this complex area. I suppose I was also pleased just to note that point you make around circularity. A lot of the work we've done through our SteelZero and ConcreteZero campaigns is about how do we ensure the demand is for lower carbon steel, but the membership have been really keen to understand what does it mean the way we can reuse material and build that into our procurement so that we're both bringing demand down as well as making sure the demand that is there is for the improved materials. So great to have that aspect referenced. Ida, I'm going to turn to you the last to come to of this first question on the panels and to build on this conversation around supplier engagement. At Ørsted, be interested in how you've embedded low carbon procurement into your strategy. How have SteelZero commitments been part of that journey and the approach you've taken towards thinking about this?
Happy to share. But maybe first a few questions, a few comments on Ørsted and who we are.
So please do.
Even closer.
Yeah, no, please
Okay.
please do let everyone
It
know.
was loud enough in my, uncomfortably loud enough. Anyway, so for those of you who doesn't know Ørsted, we are the global leader in offshore wind. We've transformed from being a traditional energy utility, actually Europe's most both coal and carbon emissions intensive energy company, and we were very proud of our capabilities within utilizing coal for energy and heat production. Over the past 15 years, we've transformed from being that carbon-intensive company to being a global renewable energy company. We actually closed our last coal-fired power plant almost a year ago. And as such, sort of our decarbonization journey and the part that's focused on our Scope 1 and 2 emissions, the part that's about our own emissions in the organization is almost a wrap. Meaning that where we are really focused going forward towards meeting our industry first net zero 2040 target is focused on our supply chain. And here, and that's to the topic of the day, here steel is the really big game changer because 50% of emissions from an offshore wind farm across life cycle is from steel. So steel is a really, really important topic for us and how to sort of be part of moving towards lower emission steel products. And I think there has been some interesting keywords in the conversation already where literacy and ecosystem have been really important for us. And that's also very much the approach that we've taken to the supplier engagement and sort of integrating the SteelZero commitment and work into our procurement policy and the way that we engage with suppliers. Because the approach that we've taken is very, I would say, respectful towards the challenge that it is to deliver green and lower emission steel solutions, acknowledging that this is a journey, it's a transition, just like we've experienced in our own business. So the approach that we've taken in general towards supplier or supply chain decarbonization is very focused on engagement, collaboration, partnership. And we've been, like you described, Nick, very focused on supporting our suppliers in building their literacy, both in terms of carbon accounting, setting science-based targets, but also getting a more mature understanding of what does the transition pathway look like and how can we support in that. And that's back to the ecosystem points and really consider in that ecosystem where we're not the producer of steel, we are the customer. What role can we take that efficiently support suppliers in moving towards lower emission solutions? So our approach have very much been to look at our strategic suppliers. We also have direct conversations with steel manufacturers because we design our own foundations for the offshore wind farms and making it an integrated part of all supplier relation negotiations as well as dialogue that we have. We've been very focused on the data quality around emissions, but also discussing the pathways ahead. So it's more of a partnership and collaboration approach than it's setting strict requirements because it doesn't make sense in a market where the solutions are not available at commercial scale yet.
No, and I think that's fascinating because in a way there's a piece there around building capacity and relationships, but I imagine there's also been a part of that building capacity in your own organisation to be able to engage more broadly with others and be able to have that influence too.
Very, very much so, yes.
Excellent. Nick, I'd like to turn back to you, again from Tata Steel, and thinking about how you're working with your customers, and I'd be interested to get a sense of how the company is responding to this emerging demand for lower emission materials and the demand for this data that Ida and others have said we need to understand, we need to be able to explain what's in our product. How are you able to sort of bring something new to that party?
Okay, well, I'll talk about Tata Steel Group because it's quite helpful to understand that there is a global issue here as well as a national one, if you like. In the UK, we were fortunate enough to be able to transition to electric arc steel making because there's sufficient scrap in the UK to enable that transition. That is not a generic global position. More generically, there's only about 30% of the capacity of scrap availability to meet steel demand. So we have to decarbonise iron making as well as steel making. So a lot of the barriers to transition and this nervousness to invest and have the sort of the market pull that SteelZero is trying to generate, very helpfully generate, I might make the point, is to overcome this inertia that there's massive costs involved in decarbonising the iron making step, and that's an essential step if we're to solve the overall problem. In terms of data and data quality, we've worked with SteelZero quite closely in just advising on the sorts of data we have readily available, what i.e. steel makers generally do. We're not trying to be in any way, this is nothing to do with the company, this is about the industry. How can we most help advise on the data that's readily available and align it to what's required to help buyers? Because there's a difference between a scope 1, 2, 3 emission and an EPD figure in terms of recycled content and what that figure means actually. So there's again, it comes back to that education piece and that working as a partnership to help move the industry on.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is so important, and this may be stating the obvious, but when we had set up a campaign shortly before our steelwork around electric vehicles, which was encouraging companies to buy electric vehicles, and it was relatively straightforward for all of those companies to be able to say how well they were doing. They were able to count those vehicles in a pretty clear way. Again, stating the obvious, it is not clear how to do that and hasn't been so clear how to do that with the areas of steel and concrete. And so lots of the work that you're hearing from today and that we're trying to encourage is how can you get some common frameworks that support the ability to both understand the progress that's been made and then being able to talk to customers about it. And so this need to get data and find ways we can articulate the progress becomes a really critical bit of what's next in this space. Ben, coming back to you if I may. There's a project, the One North Quay project, which you've been working in a sort of a key area of being able to make progress in this space. And I maybe thought it'd be good to dive into a bit of an example now to be able to show what does this really mean in practice. You know, how are you operationalising the goals around lower carbon concrete through that project?
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, you've got the dodgy one over there.
Thank you, Mike. So One North Quay is an interesting project. It's at Canary Wharf, on the north side of Canary Wharf, and it will be the largest life science building in Europe, actually. And there were quite strong or ambitious targets for not only sustainability but carbon reduction or minimisation on that project. So what's key on this project is the buy-in from the clients, from the designer. It was Ramboll, so clients, Canary Wharf contractors, Ramboll, ourselves as the structural steel and reinforced concrete contractor, but also our supplier as well, who ended up being London Concrete or Holcim. And if you take any one of those organisations out and you don't have buy-in from them, then it falls apart. It's really critical that everyone has bought into that. The first thing that happened on the North Quay project was a low carbon concrete plan, which was issued by Ramboll pre-tender, and tenderers had to agree to that plan, and that plan was put into the contract. And that was the first time that's ever happened on any of our projects, and it's quite unusual to do so. And that shows the commitment from the clients. As part of that low carbon concrete plan, there was a target embodied carbon that we had to reach for both concrete and structural steel. There was a target, and then there was a maximum value. And so during tender, we went into a lot more detail in terms of the mixed designs we were going to be using on that project, in terms of estimating what their embodied carbon was going to be to ensure that we were lower than the maximum value allowed. We hoped to then improve it going into the project, and there are a number of things we did on that project which have done that. So we're now lower, and we're almost sure that we will be lower than the maximum and closer towards the target. So things that we've been doing on that project, there are a lot of different mix specifications, which for those of you who don't know, concrete's not all the same. There's lots of different types of concrete, different strengths, and different chemical classes. So for each one of those specifications, normally you would produce one mix design. On that project, there are 3 mix designs for every specification, and each mix design is targeted for a different ambient temperature. So when you're pouring concrete on any one day, you check what the weather forecast is, and you call off a different mix depending on the temperature. And that ensures that we're minimizing the embodied carbon associated with each mix, because you need less cementitious content in a concrete mix if the concrete temperatures are higher than if they're lower. So that's one thing that we did. That was the first time that's been done on a project, certainly to that scale. On that project, another unique thing is some of it's built over water. There used to be a marine deck there, which Kilnbridge demolished, and the aggregate from that marine deck, or the concrete, was crushed to produce aggregate, which was then stored, and that aggregate is being used in the new building. So that only saves a minimum amount of carbon, but it all adds up. And in terms of the life cycle analysis of the building, it's very helpful. Some of that carbon has then been fed into a carbon absorber, which is made by a Swiss company called Newstark, which London Concrete bought, and it's at their batching plant in Greenwich. So that aggregate goes into the carbon absorber, and it essentially adds carbon to the aggregate, which then goes into the concrete structure. And it's a small part per meter cube, but again, when you're pouring 20-30,000 cube, it adds up quite quickly. One of the other things that we're looking to do on that project, typically you minimize your embodied carbon by increasing your GGBS content in relation to your cement content, CEM1 content. On that project, we'll be looking to use calcined clays as an alternative to GGBS, so that won't reduce the overall embodied carbon of the mix, but it does relieve pressure from the demand on GGBS, which, if not an issue at the moment, it will be an issue in the next few years as GGBS becomes in shorter supply. And then on our side, as Kilnbridge, we developed a tracker prior to the job, so that all of our mix information goes into that tracker. At any one point in time, we can see how much embodied carbon is associated with each mix. Every single day, we can see how much carbon has been used, and that makes it much easier to report to Ramboll and Canary Wharf. And so we can constantly adjust targets and review the way that we're doing things and pouring the concrete to optimize and minimize the embodied carbon. That's all on the concrete side. And on the structural steel side, as I said earlier, the source steel will be electric arc furnace, but we'll also be using up to 30% reused steel. And that'll be the first time that we've done that on a project to that scale. But maybe, Michaela, you've probably got a few more examples of reused steel, which adds its own complications.
Yeah, and 30% target, I have to say, is very, very ambitious and very, very exciting. You would almost think, as Ben was speaking, why are we not doing it on all the projects? This seems such a simple solution to reuse aggregates, reuse steel, and make sure that we reach as little embodied carbon for the buildings or structures as possible. And it is, in all honesty, it is a lot of work, data collection, and time involved in that. So not all projects allow for sustainability in terms of how they're structured. So when we, for example, before I get into the reuse steel, when we get a project, the earlier our designers can engage with the consultants, the earlier we can provide suggestions on how to reduce the steel tonnage in order for the building to reduce carbon from its before the even baseline is established. So I think, that engagement, and again, it's working with our supply chain, not just on the materials, but with the whole collaborative effort of all the parties involved. So it's really amazing to hear about the case study, because that really shows the true collaboration and its success. And for us as a steel fabricator, people often ask me, so if we reduce the steel and if we make it faster or do, modular is a great thing where we can use it as well to reduce time of site and assemble things such as, warehouses and data centers and fitted units for electrical equipment. But it's essentially, if I get asked, if we reduce time on site, surely the fuel that we don't get to use and the time we don't have to hire the welfare cabins and so on, surely that will save carbon. And in the end of the day, it is really down to the steel component itself. So anything we can reduce or reuse is really essential. And 30% target is I've not come across that across our projects. We've seen as a lot of commercial buildings within London have been focusing on steel reuse in the last couple of years. We've seen a real increase into people really doing what Ben is doing. Is we want to reduce the carbon. We want to not just hit the target, we want to actually do better. So the commercial buildings that we worked on there is, for example, 105 Victoria that is due to finish either is just this month or just finished. We have one finishing in 2026, which is 334 Oxford Street. And all of these projects had a both element of EAF, a reuse steel, where we were able to either source it out from an open market, which is one of the routes you can take, or use our own stock of reclaimed steel. So we've also took a route, instead of going to the open market, where there is very difficult supply of that, because there is very few companies that can give you not just the materials that you need, the gauges, the specification that you need, but there's also an element of inspections and checks. So again, it all adds up time. So if you're working with really time project delivery scales, sustainability, if taken into consideration, does tend to delay some projects, and that's not always the answer that the clients want to hear. So it's really good to see collaboration that is sustainability is the priority. And I've even seen it in some bids and tenders where sustainability was actually percentage-wise higher than quality and health and safety. So it's really interesting to see that shift in my working in sustainability. But if we can source the steel from open market, if there is no such structural steel beam available, if nobody donates you a building where you can actually go in with demolition and say, okay, what is usable? Can we, carefully, we don't actually do that type of work ourselves, but can we work with the demolition crew to carefully abstract some steel beams that could be reused? If that's not available, we also went down to the route of having our own temporary bracing reuse, where, for example, that's again material that before would have just been disposed of. And we went down to the route of decarbonisation by actually reusing temporary bracing on our other projects. For example, from Everton, at the football stadium, we know there is going to be a piece of that temporary bracing in different projects, which helps us reduce the embodied carbon as well. But again, it's not without its challenges, and the tonnages that I often see in the calculations of the steel reuse are not as high as you would want, because of sometimes we even had to return the steel because it wasn't structurally safe, or the certificates didn't quite match the quality that we would require. So this brings real challenge, but nevertheless, one of the many routes that we are looking at as part of steel fabricators and SteelZero, of not just the decarbonization in general, but how can we reuse and have the circular material reuse in place a lot more.
I'd just like to thank Jennifer and Ben for those answers. There's such depth and detail there, and I suppose it's the piece here. It might again sound slightly straightforward. To have a procurement decision, say I'd like some more lower carbon steel or concrete, but just really going down to the piece through the process. And as we heard, the day-to-day difference of the timing you're going to do this throughout the product you're going to use to make the concrete work and reduce the emissions. This is such an ongoing, careful piece of work to get right. Jennifer, if I can turn to you now, done a lot of work with the Environment Agency, and I'd be interested to know, in a sense, how your organisation is looking at bridging the gap between introducing and piloting innovative materials, and also then how that's mainstreamed across the wider industry. Yeah,
sure. So yes, we are working very closely with the Environment Agency and also our fellow delivery partners. The Environment Agency is made very bold commitments on carbon, but like many other public bodies is also facing funding challenges. Again, they're facing not just carbon, but also various climate challenges. So they introduced a program. They saw that they needed to invest more in lower carbon technology, but they needed to invest in a way that was also going to save them money in the future. So they built what was called a spend to save business case around the introduction of lower carbon technologies, with the way of, if you can bridge the gap and massively scale up between the testing phase, get over the chasm between testing and actually mainstreaming, then in the future the cost of lower carbon materials will come down. So they were successful in gaining just over 20 million to invest in novel technologies. And that includes 2 different packages around concrete. So there's novel concrete, so that's concretes not currently in specification, and then also concretes that are in specification that are lower carbon but not widely used within our sector, but also steel, earthworks, operation and maintenance, and modern methods of construction. And these technologies were chosen, and the technologies within the programme are chosen, that they are market ready. So they've gone through a programme to try and understand not just are the technologies there, but is the whole supply chain ready to use them? So are the people on the ground who's installing, who's doing the concrete batching, who's doing the concrete mixing, are they ready? Are the suppliers of the products ready? Are the designers ready to work with these? Do we understand the risks that we're taking on within our design? Is the client understanding of the risks that they might have going forward? So they have these 6 technologies, and one of the other things that we want to do is really share with an industry, because actually we all see case studies. Case studies are lovely. They tell us how great something is. But do we actually sometimes get down to that real technical nitty-gritty of what were the challenges, what went wrong, how are we helping to shift the industry? So as I said before, the Environment Agency framework for their main flood defence works is non-competitive. There's 8 suppliers in total. We all get a share of the work. So actually, we're all in it together. And the Environment Agency, throughout our contracts, have made sure that it's not just an individual supplier that benefits. There is collective ownership of the challenges in front of us. So because of that, each of the technologies have a lead. Very pleased that Arup is leading the novel concrete and the modern methods of construction. And we look at that across all the different projects across the whole of the Environment Agency's supply chain. And I'm also delighted to say that we delivered the Hexham project, which is the first use of ultra-low carbon concrete in a permanent flood defence. And because of that knowledge, we were also reviewing some of the other consultants and suppliers' designs, and we saw that there was an opportunity to embed the learning that we got through Hexham into the next project. So we worked with those delivery partners to give them the knowledge that we'd learned through going through Hexham, and now that's been used again in a control structure. So again, a really vital component of a flood defence that needs to work when it needs to work. And by having these very open, transparent conversations, with having a client that's really happy to engage in that risk conversation, and how much risk does the client take initially versus how much risk are they putting onto their supply chain is really important. Because actually, if the client can hold a bit more risk in that early days, as we're doing the testing, as we're doing the scaling up, by the time that it gets to mainstream, we as designers, we as contractors, we in the supply chain that are providing the products, we're all more comfortable to take that next step together. But it needs the client, in some cases, to be brave and take that first initial step. So it's a 3-year programme. We're 1 year in. We have a number of host projects. They're not called pilots. They're not called accelerator projects. They are host projects that are taking the learning and then very rapidly trying to move into the standardisation. So it's trying to bridge that chasm. So we're working very closely with groups like the ICE's Low Carbon Route Map. The Environment Agency are working with the Infrastructure Clients Group to make sure that, again, that knowledge is going out, and as an industry we collectively move forward. And as part of that, it is that very early engagement with the supply chain. And interesting to hear what you were saying, Michaela, because we do need everyone to be at the table to make those decisions and to be able to move forward.
Great, thanks Jennifer. And I'm going to turn to Ida now to sort of carry on this conversation on collaboration a little bit further. And there's an example with your partnership with Dillinger. Perhaps like to say a little bit more about how that was started and what's come through from that work.
Yes, happy to. And I think it's back to what a lot of the conversations have been on here today, and my points earlier around collaboration. And there are not that many suppliers in Europe of the type of thick plate steel that we need for foundations. Dillinger is one of them, meaning that we have a very long relationship with them, and sort of the partnership and the agreement that we launched about a year ago built on that very long trusted relationship, many dialogues and discussions that we had over the years both on commercial and sustainability topics. But what we launched is that we've actually entered an MOU together where the agreement is that Ørsted gets offered the first low emission products that they will have available, of course depending on availability and commercial terms. But we expect that we will actually be able to get those lower emissions products from 27, 28. And for us, that's a way of, as I said before, taking our part in the ecosystem, actually being part of creating the very concrete, not that type of concrete, but the other type of tangible demand for lower emissions products that also allow suppliers to actually invest in lower emission solutions. And I think I didn't comment on sort of the role of SteelZero when I spoke before, but I think this is a good example of where our engagement in SteelZero has also been helpful, because it creates that reference point and sort of credibility in terms of what is it we're betting on, and where do we see the market go, and we can take that into our supplier dialogues.
Great. No, thanks, Ida. And it's delighted to hear that's working in that way. And I think it's why we're very keen that more and more buyers join that journey to be able to demonstrate that visibility to the rest of the market. And then that strengthens the ability for each of those individual companies to be able to get the value from that.
And maybe just to tie one comment to that, I think you spoke to it before, Nick, as well. For us, it's not about sort of getting the only access. It's about also being part of building the market and really using SteelZero as a platform, as a community that we can invite suppliers as well as other steel customers and producers into, to be part of this community that is needed to mature the lower emission solutions.
Yeah, this is so important. I mean, you obviously can win competitively, but there is a limit. We need much, much more of the lower carbon steel and concrete for many more progress to be made. And actually, maybe this is a piece to sort of, Ida, I'll come back to you again on this, is because this is like, well, what's stopping that from happening? Where are the gaps that can help? And whether these are incentives, tools, data, maybe talk a little bit about the policy change that you think might help the ability for this to move faster.
I think Ben, you had a fascinating example of before how customer requirements makes a difference, and how sort of how customer requirements makes a difference. And I think the customers for big energy infrastructure projects are most often governments. And I think governments sit on a very, very important tool, their policy tool. Integrating requirements into tender frameworks for energy projects is something that we really, really see as a key to unlock a wider move towards lower emission solutions, because it creates that certainty around that there is a demand here. So that's something that we'd really like to see, and which we are already seeing as a consequence of the European Net Zero Industry Act and also in other markets, but making sure that there are requirements on lower emission solutions, of course taking into account the maturity of the market, so that it also doesn't make the projects commercially unviable. So it's a balance, and it's back to the transition point you made in the beginning as well.
No, and I mean, here we get the clarity of voice from across the companies can help there, that it's, again, not just one company with a special pleading for a particular policy, but a whole range of organisations across sectors that makes that stronger. Michaela, interested from your perspective in terms of gaps you're seeing, perhaps in terms of data availability or supplier readiness, what's holding you back from achieving goals that we might be able to overcome?
As a steel fabricator, where 7% of our scope 3, overall emissions are in a scope 3, you can end with approved science-based target. You can understand that the supply engagement will play an immense role in way how we approach the engagement. And for me, what's currently hindering us in achieving his targets is actually the patience and being patient with the likes of the producers, such as Tata in the room and ArcelorMittal in Europe, as well as the stockholders, because for us, that's the two main ways the steel comes to us. So whilst the producers have a really good handle in moving progressively towards achieving their decarbonization targets, I find that we've got the good data availability. It is the stockholders we can't forget from the equation, where besides Barrett, who we don't use very much ourselves, but they're the only ones I can vouch for in having a great data availability. So in order for us to meet our SteelZero 2030 and 50 target and science-based 2040 50 target, without focusing on the dates, I think it is really down to the collaborative efforts that we undertake as part of the SteelZero and other networks in order to drive the supply chain towards the end goal, which is to decarbonize the steel industry, which is still very much possible. But it's just that we have to be patient with the technology. Some of them are a bit more further along the way. And, just to add to that point, by 2030, we expect most of the market to get there and most of the products to be available. It's just that, with slight year or two delays, it will hinder us in us achieving our targets. But what we can do is to support and, drive from our clients the awareness on that this requirement is not going anywhere. We work together with both our clients and the producers and stockholders to say, this is what we need from you in order to achieve that and demonstrate our progression on that journey. So I think it's part of the collaborative topic. It's just not shying away. But as a fabricator, it is definitely the most challenging in my day-to-day. Scope 1 and 2, we've got that covered. But Scope 3 and focusing on the producers and working with their clients on more awareness of what's available and when is definitely a big part of my role.
Great, thank you, Michaela. And Nick, turning to you now, looking at how your investment decisions are being influenced by some of the bigger changes in the market, carbon border adjustment mechanisms, emissions trading. How is this influencing what's next? And are there any risks here if we see ambition dropping in this space?
Sorry. Well, certainly governments sticking to what they promise and not changing the goalposts is very important indeed. They also have a very strong role to play in legislation and guiding and indeed procurement as well, because that consistency gives us the confidence to invest, etc. We need some really major new supply chains developing. We need huge quantities of electricity to electrify the steel and iron making processes, and we probably need that as much of that electricity to make hydrogen, green hydrogen, renewable hydrogen, particularly for the iron making process. So we need policies in place that help absolutely for those to take place. So we need legislation around electricity. Coming on to CBAM specifically, CBAM, you could argue, is quite protectionist. It's sort of creating a bubble around Europe and the UK that will mean that sort of low carbon footprint steel is protected. Wouldn't it be better if there was a global level playing field for carbon border, just the tax paid on steel for emitting carbon footprint? So we welcome CBAM as a sort of principle to promote a move away from ETS and free emissions trading screen credits. But actually, the better solution globally has got to be everybody is on that same playing field, I would argue. I don't know. Fair comment?
Well, I'll let others comment if they wish on that one. Okay. I suppose just noting, some of you may have been here earlier for Emma Pinchbeck of the Climate Change Committee, and the data she was showing there, and I'll encourage everyone to look at the reports. She talked about the 400 pages, which we have, of course, not had the chance to read yet, but the importance there of electrification, of enabling the progress for the steel industry, but obviously talking through here for transportation and wider energy use being so important, and the UK is important for that, but this is a wider European conversation aside from the policies around CBAM being so important, the investment that's needed over the next decade to drive that forward. We're coming to the close of our time here. I've got a single question to come to all of the colleagues here on this piece, which is really around advice they would give to those starting out on this journey, key things to help you get going on this work, and maybe starting with you first, Jennifer, and we'll come down the line.
Thank you. For me, this isn't an or problem, it's an and problem. So not only do we have to be lower carbon, but if we're going to meet our infrastructure challenge, we need this to also be be more productive, more efficient, more data enabled. So if there was one thing, I would say collaborate and start the conversation early. And it's not the hugs and kisses collaboration, it's the getting under the real nitty gritty, getting everything out on the table, the risks, the mutual alignment. And I think that's where the change will happen.
I think for me the number one thing would be education of the boards, education of managers and the workforce as well. There's a lot of people who don't really understand what net zero means. They don't understand what scope 1, 2 or 3 emissions are, and they see it as this thing in the future that's impossible to achieve, but we all know it's not, and we all know the steps that need to be taken to get there. It is achievable as long as you've got support of governments and other organisations, etc. So education, I think, is the number one.
And I think I'll build on that point and then add internal education in an organization. And for a customer like us, it's really about understanding also what are the challenges and what is the available solutions, what are the possible pathways to decarbonized products that your suppliers can offer, so that you can engage in an eye-to-eye conversation on how do we move forward, so that it becomes a partnership and becomes a collaboration.
2 little points I would say. One is about understanding carbon footprint data. Make sure you really understand the data you think you need and understand it well enough that you can really challenge a supplier to know that it's credible data, etc., and that you really understand what information you're actually being given. And the other, I would just infer from the conversations we've had, the circularity hierarchy has been talked a lot about here. Top of the hierarchy is reuse, then we've got refurbish, and then we've got recycle. Well, we can help with the recycling at the end of life, but absolutely, working further up the hierarchy is clearly the best thing to do.
And for me, it would be, as a sustainability professional, I do share a lot of the frustration that is currently happening in the sector. It's obviously very volatile, and some of the sustainability initiatives seems to be put on a back burner, and they're basically not being taken forward. But I think instead of losing hope and willingness to be engaged, I think it's really, without trying to quote a leading shoemaker, it's just about doing it. It is about the small wins and small action, because altogether they have a collaborative contributing impact, such as us collaboratively contributing to SteelZero. And once you run out of the quick wins, which might take a while, I'd say you get down to the nitty-gritty, as Jennifer said, because that's where the real further tangible impact will lie, and that's what we can achieve together. So I would say it's the small actions that count. And I sit through some of the talks today, and what was clear from the keynote this morning was everybody in the room has a role to play, no matter the job that you hold or no matter where you are in the company. So it's about challenging both internally owned organizations and the industries where you see something that could be improved and made better with case studies and things that how are proven to work, then just do it.
Well, what a brilliant way to close that. I mean, I think this is an area where there is a lot of nervousness about whether companies are pulling back and being cautious around some of this topic. The level of detail that you've heard from all of the panelists today show both the nitty-gritty you need to get into, but also where the real value is that is being spotted by those organisations. And there may be a difference to the publicity, but actually the potential that can be got from this is very real to the business models of all the organisations we've heard with, which is, I think, which gives us a lot of, in a sense, some optimism for the potential for this to drive forward. And indeed, the fact that people are working so carefully on this shows the potential to really make some proper progress over the next years, which we undoubtedly need to do. So look, I would like to say thank you to all the panel for the detail they've given and showing that forward. I'm having some fingers saying with this, I mean, we're coming to a close now, but I guess if there is a moment for a question, if anyone would like to do so. Yes, we've got a gentleman here at the front. Is someone able to pass a mic to just on the right? Just in the third row.
Thank you all for speaking to us today. My question for anyone who wishes to answer it, I suppose, maybe mainly at Nick, as he mentioned CBAM earlier, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Recently, I think it was something like 90% of importers were made exempt from that CBAM mechanism, as well as various other tweaks. And I believe that some of the reporting requirements were made easier as well for the companies that did have to go for it. So my reaction, or my question would be, what is your reaction to these happenings, and does it help you meet those transition targets? Because as you mentioned earlier, it's not about going for the absolute lowest carbon solution.
Interesting. Well, I'm not totally up to speed on the latest changes in CBAM, although I did understand that the European scheme had gone backwards slightly in terms of implementation. They're still very much in the data collection phase of CBAM data from suppliers, and that is been very helpful in terms of companies learning what information they need to supply and how they need to supply it, and then others, if you like, receiving it, assessing that data quality. So I'm not sure I could really answer the question properly. I think a fair and consistent approach to how CBAM is implemented is just the most important thing. Perhaps others would like to comment. Sorry.
I would just say we've been reporting on for CBAM for the last year and a bit now, and as an organization who has been quite mature in terms of the data collection, I actually found the changes. We've already got the data. I don't, like for me, I don't see the point why I would report on less data if I have it available, but it's definitely been helpful to a lot of the people that were not quite up to speed. So as we mentioned, data is the key in terms of measuring the impact both for your organization and the industry. So the fact that it is decreased in terms of requirements, whether that's going to stay, it's debatable. Whether they're going to increase it, like similarly what they do with CSRD, there's a withdrawal of some of the stricter requirements, merging them together. Could we expect that this will increase in time in terms of importance and future detail required? Possibly, but it was a really big administrative burden on many. So as someone who has to support the reporting, I did welcome the change, although we still collate the same data. It was more of a relief in terms of, okay, this is definitely a lot more manageable now, because the detail behind it, although we've got it at the background, we don't actually have to do and report on. So it might seem as a small win for us and the colleagues, but actually if you got the data behind it to prove in terms of auditing, which they can also come and do, then you're already taken care of. So in terms of that, I don't know if that answers your question, but there are tools out there that companies can also look into and using in terms of helping them to report, which again, their suitability now that the requirements are reduced, maybe they're turning into more suitable for other reporting requirements within Europe.
That's a really good point, I think, because we too find it easy to report. We have all the data, but if it means that more people can report, then a more holistic coverage of the supply chain, actually that's probably a better win, isn't it? Yeah.
We should draw to a close. Thank you, Michaela and Nick, for responding to that one. Thanks to the fantastically knowledgeable panel. I've been delighted to hear them all talk about in different ways the way in which collaboration comes through and the role of collective initiatives like SteelZero and ConcreteZero. If you'd like to find out more about that work, please follow up with myself or colleagues around that at the Climate Group, and we'd be delighted to invite you in for further conversations. But thank you again to the speakers today.